When you see someone on television, you usually assume they're a good person, or at the very least, that the personality they show on screen, the warmth, the smile, is a reflection of who they really are. That's exactly how viewers felt about one particular finalist on MasterChef Malaysia, a woman who stood out not just for her cooking skills, but for her charm, her smile, her calm presence in the kitchen. But what if I told you that behind that smile was a very different person? That the warmth you saw on screen masked something much darker? This is the case of Etiqah Siti, a story that shocked both Indonesia and Malaysia. On December 13th, 2021 in Malaysia, a police report had just been filed by a couple living in the Lido area of Kota Kinabalu, Sabah. They had returned from a short trip to Kundasang and claimed to have found their live-in maid lying unresponsive on the floor of their apartment. She wasn't breathing. She was half naked. Her head had been completely shaved. That woman was 28-year-old Nor Afia Dang Damin. Police arrived at the scene and quickly realized this was no ordinary death. Nor's body showed signs of severe trauma. Her head, shoulder, wrist, and eyes were bruised and swollen. There were cuts and wounds. Her skin was badly bruised, and there were patchy, irregular areas of loss of skin layer. Even more disturbing, when officers examined her mouth, they discovered several teeth were missing, and not just broken. The roots were gone, as if they'd been forcefully extracted. And then there was the smell. Even though Nor's body had begun decomposing, the room had a strange scent, like antiseptic or some kind of chemical cleanser. It was enough to raise suspicions. Someone may have been trying to cover something up. At the center of it all were two people, 34-year-old Etiqah Siti Nurashikin Mohammed Sulang, the MasterChef finalist, and her ex-husband, 44-year-old Mohammed Ambri Yunus. On the surface, they were a seemingly successful couple, but behind closed doors, something much darker was unfolding. As the investigation deepened, police interviewed every possible witness, but when it came to questioning Etiqah and her ex-husband, both seemed determined to deflect. They insisted that on the day of the incident, they hadn't been home. They stuck to their story, claiming they had just returned from a trip and found Noor in that state. But the truth wasn't on their side. When investigators checked their phones, they uncovered something that would shake both Malaysia and Indonesia to the core. Something no one could have imagined. Something so disturbing, so brutal that officers were left speechless. Stored in their phones were videos, footage showing Noor being abused relentlessly and repeatedly. In one clip, she's being punched. In another, she's beaten with a metal pole. One video shows scalding water being poured over her. Another, perhaps the most horrifying of all, shows someone pulling out her teeth, one by one, using a pair of pliers. And these weren't secret recordings. These videos had been saved casually, like one might save funny TikTok clips, as if they were proud of what they had done. The moment police saw the footage, they knew Etiqah and Ambri had been lying from the start. Both were immediately arrested. Nor Afia Dang Damin was just 28 years old. According to official court and Malaysian media reports, she was an Indonesian national born in Bulukumba, a rural region in South Sulawesi. However, some Indonesian media outlets, including Kompas TV, report a different story, claiming that Nor was actually born and raised in Malaysia and had even acquired Malaysian citizenship, though her extended family remained in Indonesia. Regardless of her legal status, one thing is clear: Nor came from humble beginnings. From a young age, she worked hard to support her family. While others her age may have chased dreams, Nor's reality was survival. As she grew older, she followed a path familiar to many women from the region, seeking work abroad to provide for loved ones. After marrying her Indonesian husband, she relocated to Malaysia and took up work as a live-in maid. Over the years, she changed employers a few times, until eventually she found herself working in the home of Etiqah Siti and her then husband, Muhammad Amri. To the public, Etiqah Siti was a familiar face. In 2012, at just 24, she competed on MasterChef Malaysia Season 2. She made it all the way to the top 3, charming viewers with her dishes and her smile. After the show, she married Muhammad Amri, who was said to be either a contractor or a Petronas engineer. Together, they had 3 children and seemed to live an enviable life. Etiqah even earned a master's degree in geology from the University of Malaysia. So on paper, her life looked perfect. But behind the curtains, inside the walls of their home, she was a very different person from who others thought she was. It's unclear exactly when Nor began working for the couple, but what's known is that from early on, she was subjected to abuse, and yet she endured it, possibly because she had no choice, because she needed the job, because she didn't have a way out. Her story is tragically common. Many women from Southeast Asia leave their homes in search of work abroad, hoping to lift their families out of poverty. Men often take jobs in farms or factories. For women, domestic work is one of the few options available. But with that work often comes vulnerability, abuse, and exploitation. Nor's case is not isolated. If you dig, you will find dozens, if not hundreds, of similar stories. Migrant domestic workers mistreated, beaten, underpaid, or outright enslaved. And behind many of these cases are illegal labor agencies that traffic workers across borders, pushing them into homes where they are treated less like people and more like property. According to the autopsy report, Nor had endured prolonged, systematic abuse. The injuries on her body weren't fresh. Some had started healing while others were more recent, indicating that the torture likely spanned weeks, if not months. But investigators believe that the most brutal period of abuse occurred between December 8th and December 11th, the window in which Nor is believed to have died. She wasn't just being yelled at for making mistakes or slapped in a moment of frustration. The cruelty she suffered went far beyond that. According to the evidence, Etiqah and Amri didn't just take out anger on Nor. They used her as an emotional punching bag, and even worse, as a source of amusement. Whenever they were upset with each other or simply bored, they would turn to Nor. They dragged her across the floor by her hair, slapped her, mocked her, laughed, and then they'd record it, as if it was something entertaining, something they wanted to watch again. Among the most horrifying acts of abuse were 2 that witnesses and investigators alike described as too gruesome to forget. One form of abuse involved scalding hot water. Nor was a grown woman, yet the couple forcibly bathed her like a child. Beyond the humiliation, she was deliberately doused with boiling hot water. Burns on her skin confirmed it. The pain would have been excruciating. Her body showed clear signs of severe irritation and burn damage, injuries consistent with exposure to extremely hot liquid. Then came the forensic dental findings, details that sent a wave of horror through the courtroom. Dr. Nor Hayati, a forensic dentist from Kuala Lumpur Hospital, was tasked with examining Nor's mouth. And what she found was heartbreaking. Nor had sustained multiple injuries to both the soft and hard tissue in and around her mouth. 8 soft tissue wounds were identified on her lips, the inner lining of her cheeks, and gums. But what stood out most were the injuries to her teeth. 6 of her front teeth had been severely damaged. The way they were fractured didn't line up with what you'd normally see in a fall or a punch. These weren't the type of injuries caused by blunt force alone. Instead, Dr. Nor Hayati found something far more chilling. The damage was consistent with an act of forceful extraction. In other words, the teeth had been pulled out. The fractures ran not only through the visible crown but extended all the way to the root, breaking the alveolar bone behind the teeth and tearing the gums away from the jaw. And the worst part is that these injuries occurred close to the time of Nor's death. There were no signs of healing, no clotting, no chance for recovery. She was very much alive when it happened. And then came the video. During their investigation, police uncovered footage that forced even the most seasoned officers to turn away in disbelief. It showed Nor's mouth being pried open. One of the perpetrators held her head in place. The other gripped a pair of pliers. And then, with unimaginable cruelty, they began to extract her teeth one by one. There was no anesthesia, no attempt to dull the pain, only laughter. The video left investigators shaken. This wasn't just murder, this was torture, prolonged, deliberate, and documented by the very people who committed it. She screamed in pain, squirming from the burns, the bruises, the beatings, each injury piling on top of the last. And all of it was recorded, not out of guilt, not as evidence, but as entertainment for the very people who caused it. When news of this case broke, people were horrified. Many said they couldn't even finish reading the investigators' reports or the forensic doctor's testimony. Even medical professionals, those trained to handle violent cases, admitted that the pain Nor must have endured was unimaginable. One forensic expert described it as a 10 out of 10 on the pain scale. The kind of agony you wouldn't wish even on your worst enemy. Nor Afia died from a serious infection called necrotizing fasciitis. It's a fast-spreading infection that destroys the skin and tissue under it. Doctors also found that the infection had entered her bloodstream, which is called septicemia, and that's what caused her body to shut down. This infection didn't happen on its own. It was caused by the severe burns, open wounds, and untreated injuries on her body, especially on her shoulders, arms, thighs, and ankles. The scalding with hot water and repeated beatings had left her skin badly damaged. Because the injuries weren't treated properly, they got infected. The infection became worse and worse until her body couldn't take it anymore. What's even more chilling is how the case came to light. When Nor finally succumbed to the torture, the couple didn't call for help. Instead, they tried to cover it up. They poured Dettol and other disinfectants over Nor's lifeless body, hoping the chemical smell would mask the stench of decomposition. They just left her there in their condominium unit in Penampang, Sabah, hoping no one would notice. But, of course, the smell couldn't be hidden for long. So, in an attempt to stay ahead of suspicion, they tried something else. They walked into a police station and pretended to be concerned employers. They told officers that they had just come back from a trip and found their maid dead, that they were shocked, that they wanted justice. But what they didn't count on was this. The police investigate everyone connected to a sudden death, including the ones reporting it. And right away, something felt off. The couple's story didn't hold up under scrutiny. Their timeline was shaky, their behavior suspicious, and when the police dug deeper, they uncovered videos and images showing the couple treating the poor woman like a torture doll, sealing their fate. Just 3 days after Nor's death on December 14, 2021, Etiqah and Ambri were arrested. 2 days later, on December 16th, forensic results confirmed what police had already seen in the videos. This was not a single act of violence. A horrifying routine of brutality inflicted on a young woman who had just come to Malaysia simply to work and support her family. With overwhelming evidence and harrowing testimony from medical experts, the case officially moved to court on December 29, 2021. Prosecutors made it clear from the start they would be seeking the death penalty for both perpetrators, Muhammad Ambri and Etiqah Siti. 15 witnesses were called to the stand. Among them were forensic doctors, digital analysts, and those familiar with Nor's life and the events leading up to her death. Ambri's lawyer, Datuk Ram Singh, argued for leniency. He appealed for a 30-year prison sentence with 4 strokes of the cane, claiming that Ambri was remorseful, wanted to apologize to Nor's family, and still had 3 children to care for. Etiqah's lawyer, Datuk Seri Rakbir Singh, appealed for leniency by pointing out that she had no prior criminal record, was on medication for mental health issues, and was caring for her children, two of whom were autistic twins. He also emphasized that she was still breastfeeding at the time. Then, in a controversial decision on April 26, 2022, the Court of Appeal granted her bail. The High Court had earlier denied it, but her legal team successfully argued for 30,000 ringgit bail with one local surety, citing Section 388, subsection 1 of the Criminal Procedure Code. This section allows for bail in cases involving women, minors, or those with physical or mental illnesses. The court accepted her status as a breastfeeding mother as grounds for a temporary release, even while facing a murder charge. On October 20th, 2022, Ambry followed suit. He too was granted bail by the High Court. 30,000 ringgit with a 10,000 ringgit deposit and two local sureties. Many were outraged. A woman was dead, tortured to the point of physical and psychological destruction, and the suspects were walking free on bail. But the reprieve was temporary. By November 17, 2022, both Etiqah and Ambry were rearrested and officially charged with murder under Section 302 of the Penal Code, read with Section 34, which means the court believed they acted together with shared intent in causing Nor's death. The digital evidence, videos and photos found on their phones was critical. It helped investigators piece together a timeline, reveal a pattern of repeated abuse, and prove that both were actively involved. Nor didn't die from a single blow, but from ongoing intentional harm. This matched the definition of murder under Section 300C, causing death through deliberate bodily injury. Prosecutors pushed for the highest possible sentence. Although Malaysia abolished the mandatory death penalty in 2023, judges still had the option to impose it in severe cases, and this, they argued, was one of them. The law must reflect the value we place on human dignity, the prosecutor said, and in this case, that means the highest penalty allowed. Throughout the trial, Etiqah and Ambry, reportedly divorced by 2024, kept blaming each other. But the videos told a different story. Both had played active roles. Silence was complicity. Participation was clear. In the end, both were formally charged under Section 302. With the death penalty now discretionary, the court could sentence them to death or imprisonment of 30 to 40 years. On June 20th, 2025, the verdict was finally delivered. High Court Judge Datuk Dr. Lim Hock Leng found both Etiqah Siti and Mohammed Ambry guilty of the murder of Nor Afia Dang Damin. Each was sentenced to 34 years in prison, and in addition, Ambry received 12 strokes of the cane. As per Section 289 of the Criminal Procedure Code, Etiqah was exempt from caning, as Malaysian law prohibits corporal punishment for women. Inside the courtroom, emotions ran high. Ambry sat expressionless as the sentence was handed down. Etiqah, on the other hand, bowed her head and covered her face, whether out of shame, fear, or remorse, only she would know. Despite their lawyers' emotional appeals for leniency, the judge stood firm, stating that the cruelty suffered by the deceased and the systematic, prolonged nature of abuse left the court with no choice. As news of the sentencing spread, it ignited widespread outrage across Malaysia and far beyond. People were stunned not just by the brutality of the crime, but by who committed it. How could someone once admired on national television, remembered for her calm demeanor and warm smile, be capable of such monstrous acts behind closed doors? The case exposed the dangerous gap in protections for domestic workers, especially migrant women who live and work in private homes, often hidden from view with little to no oversight. Nor's death was not the first of its kind, and tragically, it likely won't be the last. In the weeks that followed the verdict, a coalition of labor and human rights groups released a joint statement. They called Nor's murder part of a disturbing but familiar pattern, one that domestic workers in Malaysia have faced for years. And they reminded us Nor wasn't the first. There was Adelina Lisao, Nirmala Bonat, Siami, Siti Hajar, Marian Skabu, Maute Khani. Names that are now remembered not for the lives they lived, but for the violence they endured, and for how long that violence was allowed to go unnoticed. The coalition once again pushed the government to pass a long overdue domestic workers bill, a reform that's been discussed for years but still hasn't become law. They pointed out something that feels like common sense. Domestic work is work, and the people doing it, cooking, cleaning, caring for children, or the elderly, deserve the same legal protections as anyone else. But somehow, that still isn't the case. They also criticized Malaysia's current Employment Act, which still excludes domestic workers from basic labor rights like guaranteed rest days, maternity leave, limits to working hours, and access to legal help if something goes wrong. In other words, rights that most workers take for granted still don't apply to them. The coalition made it clear, without real legal protections, the abuse will continue. Maybe not in front of cameras, maybe not on the news, but behind closed doors, in the very homes they work so hard to take care of. 34 years in prison for destroying a young woman's life who wanted nothing but a better future for her family. Caning for one, no caning for the other because she's a woman. But it makes you wonder, is that really enough? What does justice actually look like in a case like this? Is it just about sentencing after the fact? Or should justice also mean making sure someone like Nor is never put in that position to begin with? And in a country that relies so heavily on domestic workers, on women like her, why is it still so easy for their pain to be ignored? Why is it still so hard for them to be seen and protected like any other worker? These are uncomfortable questions, but they are important and long overdue. Let's not just remember Nor as a name in the headline, but as a person, a daughter, a worker, someone who deserves safety, respect, and a future. That is all for today. Thanks for watching.